Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me here today. I wanted to take the opportunity to address the matters that have been raised in recent days, particularly those arising from the book that has been published, plagued in recent days, and of course to take any questions you may wish to raise in relation to these issues. And I start by referring to the statement that I issued yesterday, and I'm sure you've had the opportunity to read that, and if you have questions on that, I'm happy to address. But let me just add a couple of things first, and then we can go from there. These were extraordinary times in which I had the great honour and privilege to serve as Prime Minister. No Prime Minister, I think, has faced the same combination of circumstances, be it the pandemic, or indeed the drought, the global recession, and indeed the Australian recession that was caused by the pandemic and the many other natural disasters that befell the country over that period of time. It was a very difficult time. It was a very unusual time. It was a very extraordinary time that tested every sinew and fabric of governments, not just at a federal level, but at a state level as well, and indeed tested the very fabric and sinew of Australian society. The good news is that Australia emerged well, that Australia emerged strongly, that Australia's economy, Australia's health performance, Australia's, I believe, democracy and the way we went about things emerged, frankly, as an example to every other developed country around the world. The facts of that, I think, are not in dispute. 40,000 lives saved, tens of thousands of businesses that would not be here today. One of the most common things people come and say to me after the election is people from small business. It happens everywhere I go. And they say, thank you that my business is still there today and that my employees still have a job and that now there are better times and they are doing better. Sure, it's tough still, but they know what the alternative could have been. So I'm very proud of what Australia was able to achieve over that period. I'm very proud of Australians, and I'm proud of all of those who did everything they possibly could, whether they be health workers on the front line or those public officials who beavered away in the back offices supporting governments at a state and federal level to help us all make the best decisions we possibly could at a time of extreme strain and unprecedented levels of challenge that you have not seen in this country since wartime. Over that period, we took decisions. I did as a Prime Minister, we did as cabinets at federal and state level that some of us would never have dreamed that we would ever have to make. And I remember making that comment on numerous occasions. The situation was very real. It was very serious. Events changed hourly, if not even more frequently than that. Meetings were constant. There was a procession of these and engagements. As you know, the National Cabinet met 57 times under my direction. And that highlights that this pandemic and this crisis, it wasn't a 2-month thing. It went over more than 2 years, all the way indeed up till the time of the election, and in its own form today continues. And there are challenges still even now. The prospect of serious loss of life, of disruption to civil society, of the collapse of our economy, as we were seeing in other parts of the world, was real. As we sit here now in the relative calm seas, or perhaps from the safety of the shore, and we look back at a time which was a raging tempest, people can be led to make judgments out of context. But the context was very real. I was very mindful of it, as were all of my colleagues, and I'm sure at a state level as well, who I sought to work with constructively the whole time. The situation was highly uncertain, as I've said, and dynamic. And I'd make this point. There was a clear expectation established in the public's mind, certainly in the media's mind, and absolutely certainly in the mind of the opposition, as I would walk into question time every day, that I, as Prime Minister, was responsible pretty much for every single thing that was going on. Every drop of rain, every strain of the virus, everything that occurred over that period of time. Now, I'm not taking issue with that, But this was the expectation, and I think the Australian public had an expectation that the Prime Minister had the authority to even overrule states. Now, that was not the case. But where there were authorities or powers that could be established, there was a clear expectation that I, as Prime Minister, would have sought to put those in place to protect the country and lead us through what was a very difficult period. People held me rightly to account for that. We've had an election, and that's been run and done, and here I am before you today no longer as the Prime Minister. That is our great democracy, which I cherish. Having said that, at that time, people expected me to be able to take what responsibilities I could to deal with the issues I was dealing with every day, and I did so. I did so. There were gaps. Our system, I think, was put under the microscope and put under strain, and I hope that the experience of this time will assist those in the future to better understand how these issues can be managed, and I'm happy to cooperate with any positive purpose or any positive process that is really about understanding that, because I know better than anybody the types of issues we had to deal with on a constant basis. And there are gaps in how our systems work, and we sought to overcome them. The very creation of the National Cabinet was an example of that, recognising that the Commonwealth had no power over the states. But equally, we found a mechanism as best we could to have it work together. There are critics of that, but it continues to operate today as an example of what I hope is a durable institution that will facilitate cooperative relations between the states and the federal government. So, in that context, with an understanding of the expectation of public responsibility singularly directed at the Prime Minister, I believed it was necessary to have authority to have what were effectively emergency powers to exercise in extreme situations that would be unforeseen, that would enable me to act in the national interest. And that is what I did in a crisis. Because frankly, I'd rather be having this conversation about what I did do to try and protect the Australian people. And if there are views that overstepped the mark, happy to have that conversation. Because what was focusing my mind was not having the conversation that perhaps I could have put powers in place if situations had arisen that I hadn't been in a position to address because I hadn't done the things that have been set out in recent days. So I'd rather have this discussion about what I did do rather than what I didn't do in order to ensure that I was exercising those responsibilities. So, together with my colleagues, we did save lives, we did save livelihoods, and we did so in a way that, as I've moved around the world since the election, is recognised. And there will come a time here, I suppose, it will be maybe recognised also, but that is not my purpose today. A couple of other points. I want to stress with the 5 departments in which I was sworn to administratively by the Governor-General, at no time, except in the one instance that I've made reference to in relation to resources in the Department of Industry, did I interfere in any of the decisions or exercise those powers in those departments. Secondly, I did not act as minister. There were not 2 ministers doing the same job, me as Prime Minister or the Minister. You may not be aware, and I think these events have highlighted perhaps some unawareness of these types of arrangements. For example, Ben Morton was the Minister assisting the Prime Minister and Cabinet. He was also the Minister for Public Service. That did not make him the Prime Minister, despite the fact he was sworn to the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. It didn't make Ken Wyatt the Prime Minister. It didn't make Michael Suker, who was the Assistant Treasurer, the Treasurer. It didn't make Jason Wood, who was sworn to the Department of Home Affairs, the Minister for Home Affairs. These matters, as to what ministers do, are set out in charter letters which instruct the department and the minister on the matters that they are responsible for exercising on a daily basis. In taking on these authorities from the Governor-General, I did not instruct any department that I was to have jurisdiction or carriage of any of the issues that the ministers were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. They continued to exercise their powers as ministers fully and wholly, except in the one instance in relation to the decision that I referred to in my statement. I did not exercise those powers, and I had the power, though, to act if that was necessary. The powers that I was exercising and being sworn in administratively to those roles were lawful, based on the advice and working through those issues, as was done by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Office of the Governor-General, my own office. Those are obvious issues that were being addressed at the time, and we understood to be acting completely lawfully. But the point here is that at no time, because the accusation has been made that somehow this was seeking these additional powers for what purpose personally, I cannot understand. I didn't exercise them because thankfully the extreme circumstances in which I had established these powers to act in, thankfully, did not arise. The fact that ministers were unaware of these things is actually proof of my lack of interference or intervention in any of their activities, and that I honoured the basis upon which I sought those powers because I was only ever going to use them in an emergency situation that would require that. Now I understand the offence that some of my colleagues particularly have felt about this. I understand that, and I've apologised to them. But equally, as Prime Minister, only I could really understand the weight of responsibility that was on my shoulders and on no one else. And as a result, I took the decisions that I thought I needed to take. I took the calls that I thought were necessary, and over the course of my time as Prime Minister, I sought to pursue the national interest on that basis, not for any personal advancement, but to get Australia through one of the worst crises we have faced since the Second World War. And the good news is, Australia, we got through it because of you, because of the actions that we all took in the areas we had responsibility. And that is a story I think Australians should be very, very proud of. Now, I make one other request while I'm here before I go to questions. One of the reasons I've come here today, I set this all out in a statement yesterday, but I'm happy to take the questions today because I would ask this of the media. As a Member of Parliament, of course I'm accountable and I'm happy to be here today, but members of my family have nothing to do with this. I would very much like that the cameras that sit outside my house each day and film my wife and my daughters going to school or going for a coffee, or if they would like to have friends around or tradespeople coming, they have nothing to do with this. And so out of respect, by all means sit outside my electoral office. There's great coffee down in the Cronulla. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. But I would ask that you not invade the privacy of my family. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. Happy to take your questions.
Mr. Morrison,
Andrew, I'll get round to everybody. We've got plenty of time.
Why did you deceive the Australian public and your Treasurer and Finance Minister about this?
Well, I don't share that view.
They didn't know.
I didn't inform them. Had I been in the situation, Andrew, where those powers had to be used, then I believe that was the time to have that conversation, because that's when the powers would be enacted.
All right, well,
the powers were established as an emergency power. The powers that were later established, there were 5 portfolios. The latter ones, as I indicated in my statement yesterday, I think in hindsight proved to be unnecessary.
But Mr. Morrison, you told Greg Hunt, and the book says, you said I wasn't being sworn in as Health Minister. The book, and I presume you spoke to the authors of the book about this, am I right in assuming that?
Keep going.
Says you swore, I trust you, but I'm swearing myself in as Health Minister.
Well, that meant I was swearing myself to have authorities under the portfolio. As I've made very clear, and as the then Minister for Health will tell you, did I exercise any powers in that portfolio under that? No, I didn't. He continued to be the Health Minister. This was the first of these things that we first addressed, and it arose because of the rather unusual nature of the biosecurity powers, which were unprecedented in Australia. Let me finish the answer to the question. What we did was, in that particular instance, we were dealing with extra powers, new powers that were enlivened under the Biosecurity Act. And in talking with Greg and how we would manage that new set of powers, then we'd had that discussion. My honest recollection was that there'd been a communication between officers in relation to the Minister for Finance. That didn't take place. I accept that, and I've apologised to then Minister Coleman for that. But equally, that also related to additional spending powers that were delegated to the Finance Minister at that time.
And
The later ones were added in May 21 as the pandemic was continuing, because in all the portfolios that I sought to have these authorities put in place, they were portfolio areas where ministers could exercise unilateral decisions without reference to cabinet. So that is a very different thing from portfolios where the decisions minister makes are implementing the decisions of cabinet. Now, we were in a rather extreme situation over a protracted period of time. Those safeguards were put in place for precautionary, for prudent and responsible reasons, and I didn't consider it at the time, given everything else that was going on and the other priorities we were dealing with, that it was a matter that needed to be raised at that point, because if I needed to use the powers, then I would have disclosed them with the minister. Come here, and I'll keep going around.
Why not simply advise your cabinet colleagues that you were doing this? I mean, you said you had this, there was an expectation on you that you were responsible for everything. This looks like an extraordinary consolidation of power. Why not even just let your cabinet colleagues know, if not the broader Australian public?
Well, as I said, I apologise for any concern this has caused about those issues, and I understand that concern, and that's why I'm standing here today. But at the same time, I did not want any of my ministers to be going about their daily business any different to what they were doing before. I was concerned that these issues could have been misconstrued and misunderstood and undermine the confidence of ministers in the performance of their duties at that time, and I did not consider that to be in the country's interest.
You didn't have the courage to tell them.
I did what I thought was necessary in the national interest to ensure the government continued to perform well, which it did.
Mr. Morrison, was there a specific issue or event that prompted you to take over Treasury and take the Treasury and Home Affairs ministries on 6th of May after the other ministries?
No.
And if there was an expectation that...
The answer to that is no.
If there was an expectation on the part of the Australian public that you were in charge of everything, why didn't you tell the Australian public?
Well, again, these were emergency, effectively reserve powers. I think there was a great risk that in the midst of that crisis, those powers could be misinterpreted and misunderstood, which would have caused unnecessary angst in the middle of a pandemic and could have impacted on the day-to-day functioning of the government. No, that's not what I said. I said there was a possibility of this being misinterpreted. And frankly, the events of the last few days, I think, have highlighted how these things can be misinterpreted.
Mr. Morrison,
you say that you seem to be saying that your actions were prudent and they were right. But if that's the case, what are you apologising to your colleagues for?
For the offence that was caused to them.
But, so are you maintaining that you did nothing wrong, but the offence is the thing that you're apologising?
Well, of course I regret that offence and apologise for that offence, but I'm pleased that through the course of the pandemic, my confidence was in them to keep just doing their job. Now, the fact that I didn't interfere in doing their job shows the confidence I had in them. Now, there were many issues that arose over that period of time where, if I'd wished to, I could have exercised the authorities given to me in their portfolios, but I did not do that. And I did not do that because I did not consider that they were consistent with the emergency situations and emergency powers that I had sought. So I respected the additional authorities that were granted, and that is proved by the fact that I exercised them not at all, except in the one case in relation to resources, which was a completely different set of circumstances.
So, Mr. Morrison,
why didn't you tell Karen Andrews specifically about the Home Affairs role?
Well, I think I've already answered that question.
She's asked for you to resign.
Well, my answer is this.
These are dictatorial powers in the way that you're talking about them, this power grab, as if there's no democratic institutions, as if you're the only one who understands what the nation was going through. Why didn't you share it with Karen Andrews and the other colleagues in your cabinet?
Well, I've already addressed that question, but in relation to the other point that you made, I'm an elected member of the Parliament. I went to the 2019 election as the leader of the Parliamentary Liberal Party and as Prime Minister, and was duly elected. Now, as Prime Minister, you have the authority given to you as a consequence of that election to determine the responsibilities that every single minister has in your advice to the Governor-General.
Why you
Those
have them?
powers
That's too
are
magnificent.
exercised democratically by a democratically elected leader and were done so lawfully by me. So I don't accept that it was done in the way that you've suggested, and I think the proof of that is the fact that they were not exercised because I did not consider there were any circumstances that would justify the use of those powers, which is a point which seems to have been lost. So I'll go up the back. I'm going to work all the way around, so over here.
Did you seek any other legal advice about this other than from your Attorney General?
The advice that I received is a matter between me and the department, and the department advised me on these matters and implemented and administered these decisions and did so in concert with the Office of the Governor-General.
Mr. Morrison, why don't you tell us who you asked for?
Well, as I said, I sought advice from my department, which is the standard process. Again, I don't go into, as Prime Ministers and Ministers don't, because the advice that is provided is a matter between ministers and their departments. And the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet advised me on these matters, and I understand these matters to be entirely lawful.
Well, one time you said you could use these powers on the PEP project.
Yep.
If I recall from the press conference, you said that you were doing that as Prime Minister. Didn't
Correct.
you fudge the truth then? You didn't say that you were actually doing it as the Minister, which you'd secretly
Well, I was the
appointed
Prime
yourself
Minister.
to that portfolio. You didn't say that you were doing it as the Administrator.
Well,
of
that's
that
the only way I
portfolio.
could have exercised those powers. I mean, anyone familiar with that issue would have understood that those powers could only have been exercised by someone who had authority under that department. The applicant certainly understood that. The applicant certainly understood that. I can't.
So would you have known then that you'd appointed yourself? to
Well,
the portfolio?
I can't speak for what is known and not known by those asking me questions about what they know or don't know about the operation of that Act. I said that I'd made the decision as Prime Minister, and that meant I had to have been able to do that with an authority to do that under that Act.
So it's the public's fault for not figuring it out.
Well, I didn't say it was the public's fault. I mean, I just said I made it clear I was making that decision as Prime Minister, which I did.
Mr. Morrison, there seems to be a bit of heat on the Governor-General today and as to the reasons that he made these appointments. When you spoke, when the Governor-General was swearing you in into these extra portfolios and giving you this extra responsibility, did at any stage he ask you to make it public?
Well, I think the criticisms of the Governor-General are egregious. I think the Governor-General acted with absolute propriety and did everything that was expected of him in these arrangements, and he would have taken the necessary advice from his own office, and the suitable engagement was undertaken between my department and the Office of the Governor-General. Now, there was no swearing-in ceremonies. That is the point. These things were done administratively.
Yeah, sure.
So there was no such interaction like the one you're describing, because that's not how it was done.
You never
Do you-
spoke.
do you regret
I didn't say that. I said he was asked whether I spoke to him at the swearing in. There was no such swearing in.
Did he?
How long, Andrew? Everyone's getting a turn and we're going around. I'll come back to you, it's fine.
The only time you exercise these additional powers to knock back a gas project, which has nothing to do with the pandemic. So your logic that you use these powers to manage the pandemic is actually completely flawed.
No, I made it very clear about the two different types of circumstances in which I established
Why
these
did you need to
powers.
be resources?
I said there was the pandemic-related portfolios, and I've been clear about that. And in my statement yesterday, I was very clear that there was a different set of circumstances in relation to that project. Now, I don't regret that for a second. And I don't think anyone who went surfing off the New South Wales coast this week, up around Newcastle or the Central Coast or off the northern beaches, would take any issue with a Prime Minister who lived up to his word and considered this matter from first principles, as I was required to do under the Act, which I did, without prejudice,
What's that
worked
got to do
through
with
the
the pandemic,
issue
though?
and made a decision that did not see that project or that lease to be extended. Now, I think that was the right decision.
what's it got to do with
Had
the
I... Well, I didn't say it did.
So how can you
The
argue
assertion
that?
that it
How
had
can you
something to do with the
argue that
pandemic
anything other
is
than
not true.
political?
I
How
said
can
there
you
were two...
argue, though?
Hang on. There were two circumstances in which I put these powers in place.
Would you have done that in
One...
normal times?
Sorry?
Would you have done that in normal times, though, taken over that portfolio if we weren't in a pandemic?
Yes.
So there's one
In that
circumstance where it's
circumstance,
emergency.
on that issue, where I believed that was necessary,
Why didn't
that's
you
what
tell
I
us?
did.
Why didn't you tell us, Mr. Morrison?
Well, as I said, I made the announcement on that project as the Prime Minister, and I said I did that with the authority, that I
So
needed
how
to
can
do
you
that
argue
project.
then that it's anything other than political in terms of that takeover of that portfolio?
You're talking about the resources portfolio?
Yes. With
No, it's about the
takeover
Prime
decision.
Minister making a decision in the national interest and protecting our environment. I mean,
Why couldn't your minister do that?
I believed I needed to consider that matter
So
directly.
you don't have faith in your minister then, is that what you're saying?
On that issue, we had a number of discussions, and I decided to consider that matter directly. I thought the minister did an outstanding job, and I wanted him to continue
So why not
doing
let
the
him
job
talk?
of the minister.
Why not let him talk?
I wanted him to continue doing the job of the minister, but on that particular project, I believed it was in the national interest for me to consider it in its totality, which I did, and I'm very happy with that decision. And if people think I should have made a different decision and allowed that project to proceed and to allow that drilling to occur off the New South Wales coast, well, they can make that argument, but I don't agree with it.
Morrison, take us
Hang on, we haven't got all the way around it.
What's your commitment to your electorate of Cook in
Absolute.
short term? Sorry?
My commitment to them is as it's always been, and I greatly appreciate the tremendous and wonderful support I get from my local community in the Sutherland Shire and St George. I particularly thank them for the strong support they've given me in recent days, and I'll continue to serve them as the member for Cook, and I'll make a decision at an appropriate time as to whether I contest the next election.
At any point, did you have conversations with the Governor General about taking over the portfolios, and did he ever raise any questions about you taking over the portfolios?
Well, I will follow the practice that all Prime Ministers have in the past. Ex-Prime Ministers, I don't go into private discussions with the Governor General. I don't do that. And I don't believe
But did you
the
talk
Governor
to him?
General.
I'm not asking the content.
I have
Did you
had
have a
numerous conversations with the Governor General over many topics over many years, and as you would expect me to do. But those conversations are between us, and they are private conversations, and I don't
But did
intend
he
to
want
disclose
you
them.
to- but did he want you to
We have
make this
right
matter
to know
public?
whether he said to you, shouldn't we make this public? Can you at least tell us that? You've been secret about this whole business.
No,
Can
you were
at
asking me
least
to
tell
go
us that?
into conversations between me and the Governor General, which I'm not
So
going
we
to
assume
do.
you did.
No,
We
you
did
can't.
question you
You
as
can't.
to-
No, you can't assume
Okay, well,
anything,
it's pretty
Andrew.
easy to deny
And
yourself.
I'm not
You
going
did
to.
tell
Well,
press
I'm not going to be
reporters, so why
verbal,
did you?
Andrew, or bullied in this press conference by you trying to put words in my
Mr.
mouth.
Morrison,
I am simply
no,
respecting
no.
a
It's one
long-standing
simple question.
principle and convention that the Governor General and the Prime Minister have many conversations. The Governor General took the advice of the day from the government and acted accordingly
Did he
and
ever
ensured
question
that is
whether it
not,
should be public?
Andrew, that is not something that any former Prime Minister would responsibly
Morrison,
answer in
you
divulging
did tell us
conversations
about
with the
the
Governor General,
emergency.
and you can draw no conclusion from that. You can assert nothing about that. You can impugn nothing about it, because if you did so, then you would be an error.
Do you regret now that you put him in?
Yep.
Do you regret now
So we're going round again.
That this process of you approaching the Governor General and asking to be appointed to these ministries...
Well, that was done by the department and my office. This was not
So
done
it
by me
wasn't-
directly.
It wasn't done in person, and
No.
there were people inside your office, even though your cabinet colleagues didn't know about it, there were people inside departments that did know that you were seeking these ministries. and
Of
were
course.
Did you make
That's how they were affected. Andrew, we're taking turns. Yeah, sorry, was that?
that even though your cabinet colleagues didn't know, there were people inside the PMO and others who did.
Well, there was people in the department and the people in my office who were directly responsible for managing these specific things. Of course there was.
And
That's
the
how
committee
governments
instrument
work.
that you signed, it wasn't done in person.
No, it wasn't.
Was the government...
That's not the only time. That there are other circumstances that happens from time to time when ministers are sworn to portfolios out of session to exercise responsibilities in particular departments. Not every swearing in takes place, on the steps of Government House. I mean, that's just a fact.
Was the Governor General ever asked not to publicise the swearing-in? And when you say that the use of the powers was different between the health ministries, for example,
Yeah.
and the resources portfolios,
Yep.
are you effectively saying that one is an emergency power and one is just when you want something to happen, you're entitled?
Well, I'm saying that they were two different sets of circumstances. There was emergency powers which I had put in place that were dealing with pandemic arrangements. The resources portfolio decision was not one of those. That was a separate issue that I determined to consider directly myself. I've been very open about that. That's what I've done. I took that decision. I took it lawfully. I took it in accordance with the process that was necessary to follow to make such a decision, and I believe it was the right decision.
So where's
on the Governor General? Sorry, just on the Governor General. On the Governor General. The Governor General ever asked not to publicise?
The administration of these decisions was done by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. So they're the ones who then follow through on any advisings or publications or anything of those decisions. So that, no, well, I'm saying those issues were dealt with between the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Office of the Governor General, not by me.
Do you know whether the Governor General was ever asked not to publicise?
I don't believe he was.
Mr. Morrison, whose idea was it first for you to be sworn into the private portfolio this way? Were you advised by someone that you should do this, or was this your idea?
I believed it was a prudent and responsible action in the middle of the crisis to have these emergency powers in place to ensure that I could exercise the expectations of my responsibilities, which I remind you was put to me on a daily basis by members of the media, by the opposition, constantly telling me that I was responsible for everything, even the actions of state premiers and decisions that they were taking, and that I should be able to override them. And to this day, people still make the argument why I didn't exercise some sort of non-existent prime ministerial authority over the states and territories. So this is something I dealt with every day. The expectation was created of that responsibility, and I made sure that I was in a position to act should I have to, and thank goodness that was not necessary. And I think this is a point that is being overlooked. The non-exercising of these powers proves that they were handled responsibly, that they were not abused, that they were there in a reserved capacity to ensure the Prime Minister could act if that was necessary. I respected them because I understood they were important powers. I made a decision in industry in the national interest.
What was your idea to do this?
Well, it was a discussion that we had, and I take responsibility for those decisions, as I do of all decisions of my government.
How much were you paid for the speeches you gave abroad since the election, and will you declare it a full cash?
I'll make all the necessary disclosures on my register of interests as you'd expect me to do, as previous members of Parliament have done.
Why don't you just tell us now?
Because that's not the process for how it's done in the Parliament, and I answer to the Parliament, and I will complete the register of interests as you expect me to.
Mr. Morrison, you've been around the world, G20 leaders, you've met some dictators, shook hands with them. You understand it's a slippery slope when you use the term emergency powers. Can you specify?
Not in this country. I'm sorry, not in this country. Okay.
Can you specify for the Australian public what these emergency powers, when would they have been invoked? Give us a situation. Can you specify not just the vague term, the pandemic as such? It's the secrecy that we're upset about.
And I understand that.
Can you explain it for us? What were the conditions?
I understand that, but I'm going to take issue with the parallel and the example that you've used.
Okay.
Australia is a democracy and a proud democracy,
Not
and there are
this action.
Well, no, with great respect, that is not the case, because the powers were put in place by an elected Prime Minister in accordance with the laws and constitution of this country. And for you, if you have a different suggestion, then you need to substantiate that, and you haven't done so. But my point about it is this. The fact that they were not enacted meant unforeseen events, and that's the nature of those events. They're unforeseen, which could have been from anything from the incapacitation of a minister for any number of purposes, or some threat to the national interest as a result of unilateral action by an individual. Then in those circumstances, the Prime Minister had the ability to take responsibility and to take action. Now, I'm very, very pleased that that was not necessary. And the very fact that I didn't exercise those powers over that entire period of time should be the evidence that I respected those powers greatly and didn't use them on any occasion. So I imagine that people looking onto this are saying, so what is the wash-up of all of this? Did the Prime Minister use any powers that were unlawful? No. Did the Prime Minister exercise any powers that intervene with the operations of any minister? No, except bar the one circumstance, which we've been very clear about. There were no other circumstances. Did the Prime Minister take any additional payment for any of these things? Of course not.
Did the Prime Minister deceive his colleagues? Yes.
And the public.
The Prime Minister,
and the voters.
And to the extent that I've caused offence to my colleagues. No, I didn't disclose it to them.
Your colleagues?
I didn't disclose it to them because I didn't think it was in the interest of the best operations of the government during a crisis. And that is for which I'm responsible. And I can appreciate, Andrew, you mightn't understand it because you haven't been a Prime Minister in the middle of the worst crisis since the Second World War. Josh and I spoke friendly.
He's not happy, is he?
Well, I've had a wonderful conversation with Josh. We had one yesterday afternoon, and we are the best of friends, and he has my total regard as both a friend and a colleague, and that will forever remain.
Can I ask you about the biosecurity? Can I just ask you about the biosecurity?
Oh, sorry, just before, because there was a similar question on both Treasury and Home Affairs. I answered this question earlier. I only did it particularly in portfolios of significant areas of importance, i.e. Treasury and Home Affairs, because they were unilateral decision-making powers of ministers.
But you took over
no, look, you've asked the question.
Why didn't you do it at the beginning?
After we'd gone through the initial phase and the pandemic was continuing, we took the precaution to put those in place in these other important portfolios where there were unilateral decision-making powers of ministers that were not subject to Cabinet.
Why then?
Not subject to Cabinet.
Why
to ensure that we followed through. No, because we were following through on the prudent, responsible measures we'd put in place in the other areas, and we added them to it. Now, as I said, well, Andrew, you may not have noticed, but COVID was still real in 2021. I mean, there is the benefit of hindsight, which is being applied here, looks back at these several years and thinks COVID was only an issue in March of 2020. Now, the people of Australia know that's not true. The people of Australia know that they struggled with the burden of restrictions and the impact of the virus for years. And you all reported on this on a daily basis. So to pretend that the crisis, pretend the crisis, but did you think there was no possibility that this wouldn't rise again, as it in fact did? As it in fact did.
Explain to us, like
the country at that point was not fully vaccinated.
Look, maybe we should chuck Treasury in there, or you must have gone to someone and said, look, you know what? We should have put Treasury and Home Affairs. Let's do it. Can you take us through that?
That's exactly how it happened.
You just decided in May 2021.
These were areas that weren't included in those original decisions, and we put them in at that later point because the pandemic was continuing.
Greg Hunt, but not Josh Frydenberg?
It was done in a matter of a very short period of time, Andrew, and it was not the primary issue of the day that we were dealing with, as you'll recall.
But Josh Frydenberg's living with you.
Just as you'll recall, in May of 2021, there were two very significant things taking place, in addition to managing the pandemic. And in that case, that was the issue of getting the vaccine program, after some initial difficulties, which we discussed, I suspect, on this room on a number of occasions and many others, back on track, and we put General Fruin in, and at that time we were dealing with those issues. And so to suggest that we weren't, worried about the pandemic is completely false. We were very focused on the pandemic and the many issues that could extend from the pandemic. As we saw in the second half of 2021, the east coast of Australia was effectively shut down because the country at that point wasn't vaccinated and had never been intended to be vaccinated by July of 2021. There was no suggestion that was ever going to take place. And so the COVID pandemic was very, very real. Now, at that time, we were also putting the budget together for that year. And in addition to that, I was in the process of negotiating the AUKUS arrangement with the United States and the United Kingdom. So there were other issues that frankly had much higher priority, and these matters were added to the reserve emergency powers on an administrative basis. They were never used, and in hindsight, I think they proved to be unnecessary. I openly say that. But I can't offer you any further explanation.
A number of your colleagues have basically asked for you to resign. Will you resign over this?
Well, of course not. and there's a couple of reasons for that. Well, I'm only aware of one colleague who's asked to do that. I'm not aware of any other colleague. I'm only aware of the member for McPherson asking for me to do that, who served in my cabinet. But these are actions and decisions I took as the Prime Minister. I'm no longer the Prime Minister. There is another Prime Minister who has a series of priorities that he must address, and I'm sure he will. But I didn't take these decisions as the member for Cook. These issues don't relate to my role as the member for Cook, and I will continue to serve as the member for Cook for the people of Cook to the best of my ability, which I continue to do today. So I don't think those two issues, they didn't relate to decisions I took as a member of Parliament. They went to my decisions as a member of the Executive, in fact the head of the Executive, as the Prime Minister.
Why not
Mr. Morrison, Mr. Morrison,
You've been very patient.
If you had your time again and if everything was the same, would you do it again?
It's a good question, and it's one that I think particularly those going forward will need to reflect on, because I don't intend to be in a position where I will be doing it again, because I don't intend or have any expectation of being in that situation. But I think, as I said at the outset, I'm very happy to cooperate with any sort of genuine or positive process which is seeking to understand the lessons of the pandemic and how these issues can be better managed in the future. But your question sort of highlights a good point. There was no guidebook for a global pandemic of this nature and the recession it caused. We had to make many decisions that were unusual, and many decisions which you were simply trying to make as on the percentages, as many good ones as you possibly could, and you were making hundreds of them a day. And these fell into that. But the context is what I'm trying to convey to you. They were put in there as a safeguard, as a break glass in case of emergency. And as a result, thankfully, we didn't need to break the glass. And as a result, I didn't need to trouble any of those ministers. Again, I think there are very good reasons for what I did. And I think the way that I would do them at another time, well, I think that would be informed by my experience.
Why couldn't you remember swearing yourself in as, why couldn't you remember yesterday swearing yourself in as Treasurer? I mean, you're swearing, you're taking over the Treasury Department, and you couldn't remember it yesterday.
Yeah, but that's a very cliched and way to put it, Andrew, but it doesn't reflect what I've told you. What I've told... No, Andrew, let me explain what I said. I did not take over the Treasury portfolio. I did not take over the Home Affairs portfolio. I did not take over the health portfolio.
You swore yourself in as in charge.
I was administratively sworn in that gave me authority, like many other ministers had, to exercise decisions in an emergency situation. It was something that was done on an order of many other issues we were dealing with at the time. No, I did not. I didn't recall. I didn't recall, and before I issued my statement yesterday, I took the time to make a formal request through the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to get the facts about if there were any other portfolios that administratively I was sworn to ensure that I could answer these exact questions, which I have done and I did in the statement yesterday. But it would be wrong to characterise it, as you have, that I was taking over the portfolio, because my actions demonstrate that I did no such thing. I didn't intervene in one decision of the Treasurer. I didn't ask for briefs that came from the Department of Treasury to be co-sent to my office as well as to the Treasurer and require there to be co-signatories as a co-minister. That did not take place. That is not what happened. Well, I've already explained to you, Andrew.
Mr. Morrison,
It's over the back.
Mr. Morrison, can you be certain that you or anybody else acting under your authority did not exercise your power in any of the 5 portfolios you were co-administering?
No, again, sorry, I'm sorry. No, I've got to pull you up because you used the same phrase. I was not co-administering any of these departments. I was sworn in with authority to take decisions in a department if I believed that was necessary, and if that were the case, then I would have sat down with the minister, explained that is assuming the minister was capacitated, which may not have been the case, and I would have dealt with it in that time. So the suggestion of co-administration of departments is 100% false.
Okay,
Did
so
anyone-
just on that, I'll
Yeah.
rephrase. Can you be certain that you or anybody acting under your authority in those 5 portfolios approved any appropriations, grants, contracts or other spending?
No, I don't believe so at all. That's the best of my knowledge. I don't. That is my understanding.
Have you checked? Because your,
As best as I
your
can.
memory has been sketchy.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough, and it was a pretty busy time over Prime Minister for almost 4 years
Have you
in the
checked?
middle of the pandemic, and I have sought some advice on these things, and advice that I received around the authorities that I was given, but to my best of my recollection, that's why I've said it so plainly. I didn't exercise any override of any of the ministers in any of their agencies except for the one that I've specified in relation to resources.
Mr. Morrison, who was the backup for you? Who was the backup for you if you were incapacitated by COVID?
The
You
deputy-
said that it was important to
the
have
deputy-
backups for other
the deputy
ministers.
Prime Minister.
Did you put the measures in place for him to
The
administer
Deputy
your
Prime
portfolio?
Minister was the backup to me.
And measures were put in place to administer your portfolio?
Well,
in
that's
event?
when I assign, when I'm Prime Minister, to the Deputy Prime Minister if I went on leave or something like that. That is assigned to the Deputy Prime Minister,
And you can make
and
acting
he acts
ministers.
as Prime
so what do
Minister.
you
And
follow
you
the
can
same-
sign in acting ministers, so that's why this is quite puzzling.
Well, it may be puzzling, but that would be as a result of not having walked in my shoes, Andrew, and understood the urgency and the nature of the circumstances at the time. You're standing on the shore after the fact. I was steering the ship in the middle of the tempest. So I appreciate that your perspective is different to mine, and I think that may explain some of the differences in our vantage point and understanding of these issues.
Did
Well,
anyone
did
in
anyone in
your
your
cabinet know that you were Home Affairs and Treasury Minister?
Well, that's already been answered. No.
No one.
Why did you take over the portfolio when Peter Dutton had COVID? You'd already taken over 2 portfolios. Why did you not do that when Peter Dutton was sick with COVID?
Well, that's a reasonable question, and at that point we were dealing with the issues in health and finance. We hadn't been moving on to some of the other issues, and that's why it was added later as a precaution.
Did you take the responsibilities, these extra responsibilities that you had, or co-responsibilities that you had, right through to the election? Was it any time that you may have relinquished them, or once you?
No, they remained in force until the time of
And
election.
just on the Biosecurity Act, I just wonder, do you think there should be reform of that Act? And also, do you think it confers too much power in the Health Minister?
Well, the answer to that, I think, is in what we did. And the former Health Minister would explain to you the many key processes that we put in place as a government for the exercise of those authorities under the Biosecurity Act, which included the ones of me taking on authority in the department if that should be necessary. So in that way, for quite significant decisions like that under the Biosecurity Act, it was like a 2-key process. And that provided a safeguard. And I think that was sensible. And I think the question highlights what we were trying to do in many different areas of government as we navigated our way through the crisis. And that was to deal with some of these problems of lack of backup powers or reserve powers or emergency powers if circumstances required it. And we sought to make do and do the workarounds that would enable us to put those things in place. So in the Biosecurity Act, I think it's worthwhile for departments and the government to look at what we did and see whether that is something they think they should put in place in the future. And I think all of these processes hopefully will help inform, should, God forbid, the country be put in this sort of situation again.
You keep saying we, right? So when you say we needed to do this, we needed to do that. So your Treasurer didn't know, your Finance Minister didn't know. So who's we? You and John Cunningham?
The government.
Mr. Morrison, you discussed this with Commissioner Porter.
I was talking prospectively.
You discussed this with Commissioner Porter, right?
On the health issues, yes.
And yet, when you took over his portfolio, or whatever you want to call it, you signed yourself on as some kind of not co-administrator of his portfolio. Why didn't you tell him that?
Well, I had no intention of exercising any powers or
But
authorities
that this was supposed
in
to
his
do, and you were
department.
doing it other
I had
so why
no
not tell
intention.
him?
Well, there was no intention on my part in that portfolio to do anything other than to consider, from first principles, the matter in relation to PEP 11. And once I had put those authorities in place, I met with the Minister, with Minister Pitt, and I informed him of that, and I proceeded to consider the matter from first principles. And that is what I would have done in every other circumstance.
I was talking about Mr. Porter's.
Well, Mr. Porter, I wasn't exercising any authority in relation to anything Mr. Porter was responsible
He was
for.
already in on the knowledge, so why didn't you?
That was in
let him
relation
know
to the
about
health portfolio. He wasn't involved in the latter discussions in relation to other portfolios.
It's true, isn't it, that you had Christian Porter assure you that this move was legal in the first place, then you systematically did that in several other portfolios, including portfolios that had little to do with COVID emergency management, and you did that without telling any of your colleagues because you knew it would make it look like you didn't trust them. That's how this played out, isn't it?
That's your narrative, and I don't accept it. Commonly narratives are put forward around politics, and some may try and fit events to those to support those narratives, but that's not my practice. What I'm simply saying is that the authorities that were established were done so lawfully. In each case, they were done with the Department of Prime Ministerial Cabinet, working with the Office of the Governor-General, and were done lawfully. They were done lawfully. And those reserve powers were in place, those emergency powers were in place if they were needed. Thankfully, they were not. No ministers were interfered with in the conduct of their ministerial responsibilities, other in this express case, which I've been very clear about, which I've also said had nothing to do with the pandemic. It had to do with ensuring that a full consideration was done on that matter by the Prime Minister, which I did, and which I suspect the people who live on the New South Wales Central Coast and Hunter Coast and the northern beaches of New South Wales will be forever grateful for. And so, that is why these things were done. I mean, there was no personal advantage to me as Prime Minister in doing any of these things, other than to ensure that should I be in a position that I confronted a set of circumstances that no one could foreknow, that I would be able to take a decision that was in the national interest and would save lives and livelihoods.
Why not simply make that public?
Well, I've already addressed that on a number of occasions in this. I mean, I accept that you may not accept my explanation, and I accept that there may be many out there who don't. But I've given that explanation, and that's why I'm here today.
What do you think?
So why not do it for all the men public?
Yep.
What do you think the Australian public think of how you handled this situation?
Well, I think I'm not going to muse on that because that's for them. But I do know a number of things. And I go back to the most common response I've had to people as I've moved around the country. And that is they know this was a tough gig at a tough time. And that we had to make some hard calls. And we had to get the country through a very difficult period. And we did that. People's lives were saved, people's livelihoods were saved, businesses that would otherwise have been destroyed, that have been working for 30, 40 years to establish. And they've come to me and simply said, look, quietly, I know there's a lot of people giving you a lot of flack about a lot of stuff, but thanks for what you did because my business is still here. I think Australians, yes, this is not an unimportant issue, and I wouldn't want to give that impression. And I think there are lessons out of all of this. But right now, Australians are very focused on what's affecting them. This decision I took didn't impact one Australian, other than those who wanted to preserve the environment of the New South Wales coast. The other measures were put in place simply to try and protect them if I had to, and thankfully I didn't have to.
Do you regret telling the authors of Plagued about this?
No. And what I find ironic about that is I disclosed it. And what I find interesting about the book that has been written, which I have no interest in the book, I have no commercial interest in it whatsoever, but I cooperated with interviews that were done contemporaneously. Because a lot of political books are written, and a lot of things are written after the event where people fit events to the narrative they want to tell. That book was written based on interviews that were conducted at the time, in the middle of the tempest.
So in 2020, you told the authors?
Well, all I'm saying is they were contemporaneous interviews that were done over the course of the pandemic. And that's why I think it makes an interesting read, frankly, because it pretty much tells the story of what was an extraordinarily torrid time for the entire country, and as governments at federal and state level sought to do everything they could to protect the Australian public. And so I'm asked about what the Australian people think. I think they're a bit, frankly, over this going, well, what's all that about? What's it got to do with me? And there are important points here about, I exercise powers lawfully. I exercise them as an elected member of the House of Representatives and an elected member as party leader that I went to an election over. And I was responsible, as you all reminded me every day, and the opposition did, that I was responsible for all of it. And that I sought to exercise those responsibilities as best I could in the circumstances I faced. And as a result, Australia came through and is seen around the world as one of the best performing countries through the course of pandemic from a health and an economic point of view, and that is something I'm extremely proud of, and I want to thank you all for your attendance today. We've had a quite robust and extensive conversation about all this, and I thank you for your attendance, and I just ask again, excuse me, the press conference I'm about to conclude, and we've had a lot of questions, and I've been very happy to take them, and I think we've covered this material in a lot of detail. I simply ask something of you and your colleagues in the gallery, as I said at the end of my statements at the start of this press conference. Having come here today and having answered your questions to the best of my ability, I would ask that if you wish to be taking photos of me, or why you'd want to see me driving around the Shire, I don't know if that's terribly fascinating to the Australian public, but I would ask that you would not film my family, that you would not be standing on my driveway each morning as they go to school. I'd ask you to respect the privacy of my kids and my wife. We're moving on with our life. I'm serving as the member for Cook. Since stepping down as Prime Minister after being defeated at the last election, you have not heard me engage in the day-to-day commentary and the political to and fro. I've sought to respect the decision of the Australian people at the election. I've made no statements critical of the government or engaged in any of that, and nor do I intend to. This government was elected and they should get on with the job of what they were elected to do. And as I said on election night, I wish them well with that task because Australia faces many challenges. I said the same thing to the leadership of my own party, and I wish Peter and Susan and all the team all the best as they do their job. But as a former Prime Minister, I intend to go on being a quiet Australian in the Shire and in St George, doing my job as a local member. And I would ask you to respect the privacy of my family, and when we're out and about doing things as a family, or down at the Sharkies, seeing them make the semi-finals. All the best.